We might get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Claire Leaney. I'm the CEO of In Good Faith Foundation, and I have Professor Amos Guiora joining me from not only a different time zone, but a completely different country. Welcome, Amos, and thank you for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. The session will be recorded and uploaded online, so please just remember to keep those cameras off if you would like to remain anonymous. If you haven't already, turning your Zoom to speaker view will ensure that you can have the best experience of this particular session. And my understanding is that for most people, that is the view button on the top right-hand side of your screen. So as a broad overview of the event, we're going to provide Amos with the opportunity to read an extract from his book and talk to it. We'll then have a little bit of a Q&A session, which is essentially the opportunity for everyone here to ask Amos and I a series of questions that we'll do our very best to answer. We would ask that everyone remain muted. And if you would like to submit a question in advance, you can use the chat feature or send the In Good Faith Foundation account a direct message. We do ask also that people use the raise your hand function available in Zoom if they would like to ask a live question. And just a general reminder to everyone here that what we are talking about today is by no means an easy subject. It is probably one of the most challenging we will ever discuss as a society. And if you have any issues or would like just the opportunity to take some care and support, primarily of your mental health, we are going to post a series of support services in that chat function and have already made them available on our Facebook page. Notably 1-800-RESPECT, and the phone number for that is 1-800-737-732, or Lifeline Crisis Support, which is 131114. All right, so just a little bit of background about In Good Faith Foundation. We work supporting survivors, families and communities impacted by institutional abuse right across Australia, and have been doing so for over 20 years now. Our focus is on assisting our community to achieve justice, acknowledging not only the enormous strength and courage, but also the sacrifice of everyone on this journey to recovery. It's really important that in this, the year of the survivor, we remember our focus on help, ensuring that people have that ability to reach for their best health and retain hope. There is no better way to do this than empowering people to find their voice and exercise their choice. Amos, when we first talked by Zoom, what feels like a lot of months ago now, and in different time zones again, we shared a collective horror over the prevalence of institutional abuse and also the diversity of institutions where abuse occurs. To my mind, this is particularly true in the hallowed ground of sports, both here in Australia, but also over in the US. And what truly united us was the acknowledgement that, as survivors describe it, it is the systemic response of these institutions that often compounds and indeed amplifies the lifelong impacts of that initial abuse. An institutional systemic response that is, it's often wholly supported by what you describe as bystanders and enablers. So I'm particularly pleased, given your recent and very successful legislative reform in Utah, to support the launch of your book, Armies of Enablers. Welcome again, Amos, and thank you for your monumental work.
Claire, listen, it is, let's just stop the evening right there. A compliment like that from you. It's 9:30 here at night. I can go to sleep and say, Claire spoke highly of me, and that'll carry the evening. I am beyond indebted to you and to Joe for making this evening possible. I don't think there are any secrets of the issue of the enabler is a complicated discussion. It's one that we absolutely have to have. And if the book contributes to that on whatever level, I'm speaking, I don't know if in behalf of the survivors who I interviewed, but this is exactly what they hoped for when they spent hours with me, that evenings like this, I don't think, frankly, and I'm beyond indebted to the two of you, that it ever occurred to me that I'd be spending a Thursday evening with my friends in Australia. I never expected, and I'll start in a second, Claire, that 2 weeks ago, I did a webinar in South Africa, next week in England. And what I have learned, and this is maybe the most important thing, Claire, is this thing is an epidemic. And that's the reality. And the epidemic is twofold. One is sexual assaults are an epidemic. And the enablers are an epidemic. And my hope is that the book shines a light, a negative light on the enabler or the enabling culture, and that together, pardon my English, but I think it's okay to say this, not to offend, but together that all of us can kick ass. And that's what needs to happen here. So if it's okay with you, I'll start reading. I apologize in advance to the distinguished audience. I am not James Earl Jones. Mr. Jones does not have to worry, that does not have to feel threatened by Amos Guiora. I'm not going to impact his financial base, okay? But if in that spirit, off we go. The enabler and bystander have knowledge that another individual is at risk. We will discuss in the book the different ways, whether directly or indirectly, in which they came to know of the peril. The critical fact is that they have knowledge. The question is, what did they do with that information? In deciding not to act on behalf of the person in peril, bystander and enabler alike facilitate the harm caused by the predator. It is my contention that both actors owe a duty to that person. The failure to act positively, to provide assistance or prevent future harm in accordance with that duty resulted in terrible consequences to an innocent person. Why? Because the enabler and bystander made the decision to walk away, literally and figuratively. That is the essence of abandonment. Both the bystander and the enabler are of paramount importance to the predator. That understanding directly contributed to my decision to pursue this project. I state in my acknowledgments that the survivors whom I interviewed, in parentheses, I spent 15 months between 20 to 25 sexual assault survivors. They are the soul of this book. I do not use that word lightly. It is intended to denote something significant, something powerful. For that is the reality of the subject matter at hand. The survivors with whom I spoke were sexually assaulted by people they trusted. In some cases, the people whom they trusted most. Were that not enough, the perpetrators were enabled by individuals whom the survivors similarly trusted. The theme of trust then is of paramount importance, for it is at the core of what was shattered by perpetrator and enabler alike. That is of great relevance in considering the consequences of the enabler's action. They violated trust no less than the perpetrator. Wherever a survivor turned, there was an enabler who made the conscious decision not to provide assistance nor to prevent future attacks. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. Tragically, it will continue to repeat itself unless we as a society loudly and clearly say enough. However, just saying enough is insufficient. We need to take action. To understand why that is critical, one must hear the voices of the survivors, hear their pain, learn how they were abused, appreciate how deep that abuse cuts physically and emotionally. In many cases, and Claire, you know this better than I do, the emotional abuse presents a lifelong struggle. The abuse is exacerbated because, as I came to learn, many survivors chose not to share their experiences with their families, or only did so many years, even decades later. The question of trust is of enormous importance here. Survivors were abandoned. That word, Claire, is critical. Were abandoned by the institutions they most loved. That seemingly made the insult deeper and more painful. They were harmed at the very places with which they so powerfully identified. The perpetrators and enablers were individuals who worked at those places. The irony must not be lost. One day, these institutions held the survivors out as examples of our excellence. The next day, they shoved them out the door. The manner in which they did so only intensifies the abuse. With a couple of exceptions, it was not a forceful kick in the ass, but rather abuse in the form of abandonment. I add in parentheses, abandonment must be understood as abuse. That is, those in positions of authority simply walked away from those in need. It was a figurative slap in the face. However, parentheses, as I came to learn, it may well have hurt more than a physical slap. Broken trust demands accountability. The word demand is used deliberately. It was a theme that survivors articulated loud and clear. Particularly painful is their recognition that the institutions to which they gave their hearts and souls have avoided accepting accountability for their suffering. That has only exacerbated their overwhelming sense of being abandoned. What they did not expect was that the institution to which they were committed and devoted, which they loved, would make the decision to enable a predator who was attacking them. They did not expect the institution, in the words of the survivor, Maddie Larson, in parentheses, those of you who are gymnastic fans will recognize Maddie's name, to enable a predator to turn her body, in her words, into his plaything. Strong words, awful words. But that is the consequence of the institutional enabling of predators. That is exactly how we must understand it. Otherwise, we will not fully appreciate or understand the degree of harm and abuse caused by perp and enabler alike. Tiffany Thomas Lopez is a survivor with whom I've spent, I don't even know, I cannot count how many hours I've spent with her. The following phrase is graphic, but Tiffany is insisting that I read it. Tiffany Thomas Lopez, another survivor, was blunt in describing the consequences of institutional enabling. And I quote, "They super fucked me." Otherwise, with parentheses I had, you can't understand the power of the enabler. Maddie and Tiffany's powerful words will serve as an important path when we consider enablers, individuals, and institutions alike. The notion of that they, in Tiffany's words, that they super fucked me is of enormous importance to us. Why? The word armies, the title of the book, Armies of Enablers. The word armies is intended to convey just that. An endless number of enablers, far more numerically significant and institutionally powerful than just one army. While one army is significant, several armies are literally insurmountable. They come at you from different directions. They use every strategic and tactical advantage possible. They have unlimited resources. They carry the, as if, prestige of seemingly reputable and esteemed institutions. They represent success and power. They are arrogant. They are dismissive. They are deceitful. They are punitive. They are adults underlined in positions of authority. And the survivor, well, the survivors who you meet in the book were between the age of 7 and 20 when abused. Who attacked the survivor? A predator known to the survivor and trusted by the survivor. Who protected the predator? An enabler, and this is of the utmost importance, importance, enabler directly positioned to protect the survivor. Without the enabler, the perpetrators would not have had the enormous confidence and impunity to act as they did. There is no question that the perpetrators we will encounter knew their actions would go unpunished. So I don't know, Joe was teaching me about Australian rules football, so I don't know if this paradigm works for you all, but it works in American football. Their actions were akin to a running back with an open field ahead of him, unencumbered, sprinting to the end zone with strong, powerful blockers clearing the way. My intention in this book, wherever I speak, is to press upon the reader through the survivors' voices the obligation to ensure the following. A, that enablers be penalized. When I use the word penalized, I mean penalized in the future. And two, that institutions be held accountable for they have chosen to protect themselves rather than the vulnerable members of their communities. It is for those two reasons, my friends, that we must listen to the survivors. Otherwise, we cannot truly understand the consequences of tolerating enabler conduct and failing to impose accountability requirements on institutions. We do not have the luxury to casually shrug our shoulders as if to say, oh my, this is terrible. But gosh, these are special circumstances that do not represent mainstream society. You know, these were athletes. BS. That specious argument fails to understand the tragic reality. The combustible combination from the survivor's perspective, and that's the only perspective that matters, of perpetrator and enabler is not limited to the special circumstances of fancy schmancy athletes. It can happen here, there, anywhere. That is the point. That is what demands our attention. We can no longer allow ourselves the comfort, perhaps arrogance is a better word, of that bland statement offered to me on more than one occasion. This couldn't happen at my institution. In parentheses, I add that one of the people I interviewed on the record told me, and I quote, at my institution, as long as I'm in control, this could never happen. Back to the book. As difficult as the conversations were for me, I can only imagine how painful they were for the survivors. Actually, I cannot imagine. It would be presumptuous. This was repeatedly made clear to me by my interactions with the survivors. They were women and men who had been violated by people they trusted, or at least had every reason to trust. The perpetrators were their physicians or religious leaders. To understand the severity of the injury requires focusing on the enabler, not the perp. I emphasize, I am not interested in the perpetrator. The perpetrator holds zero interest for me. That is why I asked one question and one question only. What did you expect from the enabler? In other words, what did you, the survivor? What did you expect from the person who enabled the perp who assaulted you? The term enabler perhaps sounds passive, as if that person were not fully engaged and not directly responsible for the harm caused. Something akin to, oh yes, that's really terrible. What's for dinner? Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be more incorrect from the survivor's perspective. To be clear, for the survivor, the enabler was critical to the assault. Theirs was not a passive role, it was an active role. Person A tolerated or facilitated the assault of person B by person C. That is not some casual spectator at a sporting event, disinterested in the final score. On the contrary, to understand the enabler, we must recognize that they could have acted to prevent a terrible act, but made the decision not to do so. In making that fateful decision, they enabled a crime. In my conversations with the survivors, the enabler was front and center. As awful as the assaults were, the survivors pointed an accusatory finger at the enablers. The phrase, quote, their enabler, is perhaps jarring because the enabler might be considered more accurately aligned with the perp. However, I deliberately use their enabler when referring to the survivor because that individual enabled the assault that occurred to them. The pronoun there is important, for it suggests the enabler had a duty to the survivor, but chose not to honor that obligation. In that context, the enabler truly became their enabler. This was the person the survivor thought would protect them, the person they assumed owed them and not the perp a duty. The survivors with whom I spoke did not walk up to random strangers and say, "You won't believe just what happened to me." Nor did they stand on the rooftops and yell to the broader public. Not at all. They did exactly what any young victim should do. Go to an individual in a position of authority whom they trusted to act in their best interests and put an end to predators assaulting their bodies. They reported to the person they believed was best positioned to protect them. As we shall see throughout the book, coaches, trainers, and senior officials created and established a toxic, word deliberate, and dangerous, word deliberate, environment that enabled the predator. Of that, there must be no doubt. To ignore this is, from the survivor's perspective, to miss a critical component of the assault. As I came to learn from the survivors themselves, the enabler's decision not to protect is no less powerful and traumatic than the actual physical attack. It is perhaps the most heartbreaking, if not devastating, aspect. For the survivor, the two are intertwined and must be so viewed. Frankly speaking, without the enabler, there is no perpetrator. Duty to act, and this is, I don't know how many of you are lawyers, but the duty to act is pronounced, even more pronounced, when the person in peril is a child, as many of these people were, and the enabler is an adult in a position of authority, tasked with responsibility for that child's health and welfare. Individually and collectively, these individuals must affix to their clothing the scarlet A that Hester Perrine was forced to wear in Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic. More important, enablers and bystanders must be brought to justice. And when I use the term must be brought to justice, I don't mean in a moral code sense of justice. I mean justice as in a court of law. The words are significant. The women and men I interviewed, I want to emphasize on their behalf the following. They view themselves as survivors. They eschew the word victim. On more than one occasion, I was reminded of this important terminological distinction. In using the term survivors throughout this book, I honor that request. More than that, while not in any way minimizing the harm done to them, and I want to emphasize the harm done to them, Claire and Joel, you know this from your work, is for life. But I want to make sure that you understand that none of them have an attitude of woe is me. In that sense, those with whom I spoke are truly survivors, badly injured by two different actors, one in physical terms, both in emotional terms. Perhaps the expectation question inevitably leads to examining what duty was owed to the survivors. And I want to make clear, and I deliberately repeat here, the enablers absolutely owe a duty to the survivors. The main point of my undertaking is to show, hopefully convince, that enough is enough. The survivors I met with are articulate, intelligent, thoughtful, and insightful. I promised them that their words would be shared with the reader in as unfiltered a manner as they spoke with me. I saw no reason, and those who have read the book know this, the book carries their language because it has to carry their language. Their emotions are anger and hurt. Sometimes more at the predator than at the, more the enabler than at the predator. I had not expected that. It was only while watching the victim impact statements directed at Larry Nassar that I began to understand the extent to which the survivors blamed the enablers for their plight. I'm going to read an anonymous excerpt from a rape victim. Right, Claire, we said we're all adults here, right? She today is an adult. She's anonymous in the book. I've met with her. She was raped by her grandfather. The day I finally told someone, my stepdad, and was told to keep it to myself because it was only upset my mom, it was her father who abused me, is forever etched in my mind. Later, when she found out, she was angry at me for ruining her vision of her father and for interrupting her idea of her happy little family. Nowhere did anyone consider the consequences it had on me, or how her mom's and the grandfather's further relationship with him would almost destroy me. Living with the anger at that inner circle is truly as abusive as the acts themselves. I still live with that pain. Powerful words. Maddie Larson, the gymnast. They forgot we were young kids away from home. USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympic Committee did not provide a safe environment for me and my teammates and friends to train. Another survivor. And the reason I'm reading these quotes to you is I want for you all to understand the anger at the enabler. This from a Catholic Church survivor. And I know Joe and Claire, we've talked about the Catholic Church. God is fuming. Sarah Shiley. Sarah Shiley was abused by the family priest from the age of 7 till the age of 14. Next, I feel disconnected from the world, alone and in pain. I couldn't trust anyone to keep me safe back then, and I can't trust anyone to keep me safe today. I have lost my ability to be confident with myself and others. To those at Michigan State, USA Gymnastics, the United States Olympic Committee, all those who knew about Larry Nassar but did not act, the sin of omission is just as bad as the sin itself. As if dealing with the intense publicity and pain around Nassar wasn't enough, you, Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics, Michigan State, you have added a heartless, depraved level of denial and victim shaming to the mix. You said terrible things. For example, that victims didn't understand the nuanced differences between sexual abuse and medical treatment. And it is virtually impossible to stop a determined sexual predator on your campus. This is disgusting. Do you know how these statements make us feel? Do you understand the impact of your words? Do you understand that these statements put other victims in a state of fear so deep that they may never come forward? Your actions, Olympic Committee, Michigan State, USA Gymnastics, your actions are abusive in and of themselves. Your attitudes of apathy and dismissal have made the healing process particularly difficult because you haven't taken action to produce legitimate investigations. This means that every day we still have to remind ourselves that it's okay to come forward. What happened to us is very, very real, even though we so desperately tried to deny it for so long. Megan Halek, victim impact statement, Nassar victim. Claire, do you want us to stop there? Do you want to keep going? What works for you?
Amos, I think we might hear a few more of these very powerful words. I think focus of this should very much be on enabling the voice of the survivor.
Some of you may recognize the name of Allie Reisman, who was the star Olympic gymnast. If over these many years, just one adult listened and had the courage and character to act, this tragedy could have been avoided. I and so many others would never have met you, Larry. You should have been locked up a long time ago. The fact is, we have no idea how many people you, Larry, victimized, or what was done or not done that allowed you to keep doing it and to get away with it for so long. Over those 30 years, when survivors came forward, adult after adult, many in positions of authority protected you, telling each survivor it was okay, that you weren't really abusing them. In fact, many adults had you convinced to the survivors that they were being dramatic or being mistaken. This is like being violated all over again. Give me a second, Claire. I'm gonna get to 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds. Again, because I'll come back to Allie because she's powerful in her words. Why has the U.S. Olympic Committee been silent? Why isn't the Olympic Committee right here, right now in court? Larry was the Olympic doctor and he molested me at the 2012 London Olympic Games. They say now they applaud those who have spoken out, but it's easy to say that now. I need to add in parentheses. Maddie Larson, again, who I spent many hours with, Maddie said that one of the things that she's sick and tired of are the PR statements put out. You know, we have the athlete's best interest in heart. When the brave women started speaking out back then, more than a year after the U.S. Olympic Committee knew about Nasser, they were dismissed. In parentheses, I add that theme of being dismissed over and over and over again. At the 2016 Olympic Games, the president of the U.S. Olympic Committee said that the U.S. Olympic Committee would not conduct an investigation. Gosh. It even defended USA Gymnastics as one of the leaders in developing policies to protect athletes. That's the response a courageous woman gets when she speaks out. And when others joined those athletes and began speaking out with more stories of abuse, were they acknowledged? No. It is like being abused all over again. I, Allie Reisman, have represented the United States of America in two Olympics and have done so successfully. And both, this is a critical point, and both USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympic Committee have been very quick to capitalize, meaning money, on and celebrate my success. But did they reach out when I came forward? No. That notion of abandonment again and again. Throughout the interview process, coaches were frequently described as quote unquote father figures. The desire to please the coach, the ultimate determinant of playing time, was paramount. Conversely, angering the coach was to be avoided at all costs. In some cases, the coach took on mythic status. To be a star athlete was a source of enormous pride to the athlete and his or her family and friends. In this context, trainers were also of great importance. They provided an ear for athletes' fears, anxieties, and pains. That pyramid, that hierarchy, is essential to our understanding. Therefore, when Ron McDaniel, then a member of the Ohio State University's tennis team, was abused by Richard Strauss, the Ohio State doctor, during a medical exam, He went directly to head tennis coach John Daly. McDaniel told me, we Skyped, reports that he went from Strauss to Daly. So he's now standing with his coach and with the Ohio State Athletic Director, Hugh Hinman, and Sports Information Director, Steve Snap. Their response when told about Strauss's abuse, a combination of ignoring, dismissing, and walking away. None saw fit to directly address McDaniel's complaint. From McDaniel's perspective, this is what happened. Strauss sexually assaulted him. He immediately reported the assault to his head coach, the university sports information director, and perhaps most important, the athletic director. The athletic director, particularly at an institution that places an extraordinary emphasis on athletics, such as Ohio State, wields significant institutional power. Beyond the considerable understatement, enormous resources for which they are responsible and the absolute control they have over the hiring and firing of coaches, the athletic director is one of the most publicly recognized individuals at a Division I school, second only to the head coach of the dominant sport. What did Hinman, the athletic director, do? He laughed in Ron McDonald's face. That notion of being laughed at, of being dismissed, is something that I find to be absolutely unacceptable. And perhaps, Claire, I want to finish with a statement by a mother of some of you may have seen the movie Athlete A about Maggie Nichols. This is a statement by Maggie's mom, Gina. So this is a mother speaking. Those of you who are parents will well understand this. Lastly, shame on Michigan State, USA Gymnastics, the United States Olympic Committee for this gross, inexcusable negligence, for allowing this pedophile to flourish for this long, and for all of these poor victims to be abused. They and every one of the people who enable this are responsible for this. It wasn't just Larry. It was all the people, including USA Gymnastics. And I see that you're representing them here. They are accountable. They are accountable. And I don't want to hear any more statements from anybody else. We're doing this and we're doing that. We have a safer place now. It's too late now. That's fine. We need to make a safer place, because what the abuse that happened to our children, you are responsible and you must take responsibility for it. With that, Claire.
Thanks, Amos. The words of survivors, and particularly the families of survivors, never cease to be truly inspiring, but also really heart-wrenching, not least of all for the courage that they display, but also for the strength it takes to carry on. I think one of the aspects that really stands out for me is the power structures and inbuilt imbalances across all of the institutions. And it appears to remain largely the same, regardless of whether that institution is the Catholic Church or USA Gymnastics or Michigan State University. And it always reminds me of the well-known and frankly overused phrase that all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. But Amos, I'd be really interested to hear, how reflective is this of your conversations with survivors? And also, how do we help people who would otherwise be that bystander? How do we help them find their voice?
Let's begin with the last question about how do we help the bystander and the enabler find their voice. I think the first thing we have to try to understand, and I'm not a psychologist, is try to understand, not understand in terms of explaining to ourselves. I'm not to justify, but to explain to ourselves the mindset of the enabler and the bystander. I actually had thought about trying to write a book on that, to explain the mindset of the bystander and enabler. And I actually started interviewing people on this. And there are various theories out there that, especially with respect to the enablers, that have maybe a perceived financial interest aligned to the institution rather than to the person. the girls, the athletes, some of them say that they had a sense that the enablers didn't like them, that maybe the enablers were jealous of them. Again, I don't know about Australia, but in America, athletes have star power. They're looked up to, they're venerated. These are people in extraordinary physical condition. They're attractive, they're successful, they're magnets. And some of the girls felt that there was jealousy directed at them. Some of them felt that the enablers simply didn't like them. I mean, jealousy and didn't like them. Some of the enablers perhaps saw financial harm to themselves if they reported. And some of them, I think, frankly, didn't care. One of the best examples of an enabler, and I can't explain her mindset, but I can only share with you when Lindsay Lemke was the captain of Michigan State's gymnastics team, went to her coach, Kathy Klages, and told her what Nassar had been doing to her. And she said, enough, I can't deal with this anymore. Klages, the coach, said three things to her. She said, one, if you go to the police, I have to talk to your parents, which is in American law, that's absolutely incorrect. Lemke was 21 years old. She's not a child. The second thing that Klages said to her was, Lindsay, if you go to the police, I want you to think about how this will impact Larry and his family. That's not irrelevant. And the third thing she said to her, again, I don't know how it works in Australia, but she said to Lindsay, Lindsay, scholarships, athletic scholarships, which pay for your college education, are given and can be taken. So that's a threat. And for that, Kathy Klages went to the right place for her. She went to jail, which is fine by me. Can I explain that? The mindset, I talked to Lemke about this. Klages, the gymnastics coach, venerated Nassar. Nassar at Michigan State had iconic status. And there was a clear sense at Michigan State to protect Larry, protect Michigan State, protect Larry. It became intertwined. And I think that notion of, it's not a word I know, intertwinement. But I think, Claire, you and Joe and I have spent so much time, for instance, talking about the Catholic Church. I think there too, you have this, I don't know if that's a word, this linkage between institution and perp. And from the enablers' perspective, they clearly identify with the institution and or perp. By the way, some of the enablers were themselves perps. I mean, that came out, and when you look at, I don't know how many of you watched the very powerful docudrama Spotlight, which is based on the Pulitzer Prize winning book by Walter Robinson and others. Some of the priests were themselves both perp and enabler, right? I mean, the institution is predicated on this wrong expression with respect to the church, but predicated on this marriage between perp and bystander and institution. One of the people who I interviewed, he's prominent in Spotlight. His name is Peter Pollard. Peter was abused by the priest when he was 14, and he's sitting on the priest's lap in the abbey. And those of you who, I'm obviously no expert on Catholicism, I'm Jewish, but Peter tells me the fact that the priest is abusing him in the abbey meant how confident the priest was that nothing would ever happen to him. And so much so that the Monsignor walks in, sees the priest abusing. When I tell you abuse, I mean abusing Peter. The Monsignor says to the priest, and I quote, "When you're done, just turn off the lights." So Peter's 14. So armies of enablers. The priest is a horrible human being. The revered Monsignor is a god-awful human being. You can't tell your parents, what the hell, where do you go? You don't go anywhere. And I think they're the Monsignor, a god-awful person. He clearly was aligned with the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are many, many similar examples across institutions in Australia as well, where people have not only survivors, but also other courageous individuals such as parents, teachers, for example, where they have witnessed or noticed these really, truly horrific events. And when they've sought to raise alarm, to draw attention to this issue, the institution has shut them down. Mm-hmm. We have people who have lost careers, who have been torn away from their families, for doing what is essentially everyone's obligation or duty, and trying to protect those more vulnerable, trying to protect children. So I'm wondering, Amos, when it comes to someone who tries to report the activity of grooming, such as a teacher, and they're rejected for trying to do their job, what damage do you think this does to the structure and the foundation of a community, particularly where it's a faith-based community?
Enormous. I learned a phrase. I don't know, again, maybe some of you watched the American TV show Law and Order Special Victims Unit. So I met with a police officer here who's our Special Victims Unit guy. And I learned a phrase I didn't know before, which is called institutional grooming, which means that the perp is grooming the institution, or community grooming. He's convincing the community/institution that they can't function without him. And in that context, when somebody tries to protect the survivor, that person, frankly, has no chance, because the community/institution has made the collective decision that we can't survive without the priest, the doctor, the football coach, whoever it is. One of the interesting things that, if you look, you can Google Larry Nassar, Richard Strauss, who's the doctor at Ohio State, and Robert Anderson, who's the doctor at the University of Michigan, which is going to be the next major sexual assault case in America. How do I put this politely? We would not say, and I hope this will be taken in the proper spirit, they didn't look like Richard Gere at all. They were actually, frankly, not very attractive people. But what they did is they used their seeming innocent looking kind of, what we would in Yiddish call kind of nebbish. They kind of look like, nerds. They used that brilliantly to their advantage. And they were able to convince the community that they're essential to the community. It's in many ways genius at work, because they look harmless. They just look harmless. And just as, if I may, in parentheses, Robert Anderson was the University of Michigan team doctor for 50 years, and he sexually assaulted, abused, raped, depends who you want to believe, between 5,000 to 7,000 University of Michigan student athletes. 900 of them have filed a lawsuit against the University of Michigan. And I am actually co-writing a new book with one of his victims who was raped while a student at Michigan. He was raped between 40 to 50 times by the doctor. But the doctor had convinced the senior university officials that he was essential, and that the players were disposable. By the way, that word disposable, Maddie Larson used that word a lot, that the athletes are disposable. And maybe that goes to your question, Claire, that when somebody complains on behalf of a victim, the victim's disposable. And the worst comes, they have to pay them off, and what's money? And by the way, it pisses them off enormously. When Michigan State paid out half a billion dollars, that's not really justice. Just go to their insurance company and pays out. That's not justice.
I completely agree, Amos. I think for justice to actually have a meaning for all of the many survivors we work with, we need to start seeing cultural change. We need to see the institution willingly, freely, frankly, and transparently examine the culture that enables abuse on such large scales, and then take meaningful steps to change that culture. And I think it was really interesting for me to hear, particularly you use the word abandonment.
Maddie Larson. It came from Maddie.
And Maddie's words as well around abandonment were particularly struck a chord with me, because I think often abuse in these settings is associated with a really powerful position in that hierarchy. And as you say, survivors rightly expect that with that power, the enabler will support, protect, provide them with care. But I think one of the things I've repeatedly observed is that when they receive that rejection, when they're first abandoned, that is the true moment where trust, where the identity that you have as part of that institution, it leaves you all alone. So I was very emotional to hear you describe abandonment using Maddie's words in that way, because it resonates through so many of the stories that we hear. And I just wanted to sort of hear a bit more from you. When you say the role of an enabler isn't passive, have you observed certain trends in the actions that they will take to protect a perpetrator?
Sure.
To protect the institution?
Absolutely. One of the people who I interviewed, he's anonymous in the book at his request. He was a swimmer at Ohio State. He is assaulted by Strauss. He goes from the examination room to the pool deck because he's a swimmer. And he goes up to his coach and tells him exactly what Strauss had just done to him. And the coach yells at him in full view of everybody in the swim team, yells to him, shut up and get in the effing pool now. That guy quit the swim team that night, dropped out of college the next day, and never went back. The impact was instantaneous because he says to him, right, you're my coach. You're responsible for me. And you tell me to get in the effing pool? It's a terrible story that repeats itself over and over and over again. I don't know, again, in terms of Australia, there are various thoughts here. I mean, here being America. There's also a race issue here. And I assume we're all adults here, right? For African Americans who come out of disadvantaged backgrounds, for many of them, the only way out is through sports to get, to ultimately play professionally. And that means that when you're playing in college, you can't be a malcontent, because if you're a malcontent, the coach won't play you. If the coach won't play you, then scouts can't see you. And if scouts don't see you, you can't get drafted and you can't play in the NFL. So what they learn to do is to shut up. And I use this word really, really carefully because it makes me uncomfortable. On some level, the system knows that. And the enablers know that. And I don't know how it works in Australia, but that's one of the themes that I've heard here, that, you just got to shut up. You got to take it. And the enablers know that. And so, I give you an example. This is an uncomfortable example, but Tiffany, the woman who I spent so much time with, she was assaulted by Nasser 150 times. And she decided enough is enough. And she went to a trainer, a woman, and showed her on her body. She showed out to the trainers on the trainer's body what Nasser was doing to her. She left nothing to the imagination. The trainer was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Well, okay, great. And she sent Tiffany to the lead trainer, the head trainer, another woman. And Tiffany went to her, and what this horrible human being did is she manipulated, along with the coach, to have Tiffany removed from the team. Tiffany dropped out of college, never went back. She's 40 years old. We've spent a zillion hours together. She tells me only now, because now she's starting to talk. She's been in the book. She received an ESPY award for courage and all that. She says for the first time in her life, she can breathe. Think about that. For 20 years, not because of Nasser, but because of the enablers, she hasn't been able to breathe. I mean, there are no words. And there, in her case, the enablers made the conscious decision, the three women, the hell with Tiffany, protect Larry, protect Michigan State, and get Tiffany out of town. It was nefarious. It was manipulative. And unfortunately, in a administrative court hearing last year, Michigan State made the decision, it's outrageous, to keep all employed at Michigan State. And Tiffany was devastated by that. Because the institution made a clear decision, the hell with Tiffany.
And I think that also is true of the Australian context. Far too often we see people who will protect the reputation of the institution at all costs. And very often the institution will reward that behavior by promoting individuals.
So in writing the new book about the University of Michigan, it's clear that one of the people who, I'm willing to bet you my second to last dollar, knew what was happening, was promoted. And that's a topic we're going to look into in the book is, wait. He knew and he was promoted? I feel like Woodward and Bernstein from Watergate.
Well, Amos, I have to say your dedication to drawing attention to survivors' voices is something that we have in common. And that's true for everyone who works at IGFF. I'm also acutely conscious that people are probably very sick of hearing my voice at this point in time. So if anyone has any questions, feel free, as we said before, to submit them via the chat or to IGFF directly, and Amos and I will do our very best to answer them all. Also, please feel free, if you'd like to ask your question live, to use the raise your hand function, and we will do our best to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask their question.
Claire, are you comfortable if I put my email in there? If somebody wants to be in touch with me offline, are you okay with that?
Yep.
Is that okay?
All right, so we've actually had a couple of questions emailed into us, and one of them is from a survivor who asks, what is our view, the panel's view, on using restorative conferences to allow survivors to tell their story to the leaders of the organisations as a means of healing and cultural change for the organisation? The second question is, when do we believe it would be appropriate to use? And if not, why not?
So Claire, I'm not an expert on restorative justice. I'm not. But if the survivors' voices can be used, I don't like the word used, but used in a positive sense, to affect institutional change, as in changing the culture, then I can understand a positive use of it, but I am not an expert on this whole notion of restorative justice. There's a discussion, you and Joe know this better than I do. There's a discussion out there, do you justice to the carrot or the stick or the carrot, stick, carrot. If survivors' voices force institutions to undergo institutional change, then that strikes me as a win-win from everybody's perspective.
Absolutely. And I think in our IGFF's practice is generally to let a survivor guide that sort of process, recognizing that it has to be meaningful for the individual. It cannot and should not be driven or dictated by the institution. And sometimes, in fact, very often we work very closely with the individual survivor to write almost an impact statement of what has happened, what the impacts have been, but also what are some of the changes that they would like to see put in place? What are some of the things they would like to have seen in place that would have protected them? I've also got a number of other questions coming through. One of which is from a whistleblower who asks, what protections should be in place for those who are whistleblowers? People like me have experienced ostracization, shunning, and defamation, loss of career, complex PTSD, and long-term health problems. And if I can sort of jump in there straight away, Amos, I would say that whistleblowers, particularly those within institutions who have the courage to speak up in defence of children, are deserving of the very highest protections we can afford them.
100%. I don't know about in Australia, but here in America, we have whistleblower protection laws that are precisely intended to protect the whistleblower. I understand that even if there are laws in place, that doesn't prevent being shunned or ostracized. But the idea of the whistleblower law is indeed to protect. But it may well be from this particular individual's perspective that even if they were protected by the law, that doesn't protect them socially. There's no doubt that coming forward is essential. I have no doubt also, Claire, that it's hard. And I'm sure that from this person's perspective, the price consequences are painful. The system or systems, I think, have to be much more attuned to not only the law of whistleblowing, right, but how we go about protecting them. And maybe there's a need there to better educate the public about whistleblowers. That could be also.
Yeah. I think education in particular is really key. We see far too often that communities react and often in ways that shun or ostracize those who are trying to do their jobs. So educating the public, I think, is a really important way of overcoming some of the barriers that are there that stop people speaking up, that stop people from acting as whistleblowers. We've also got another question that's come through in the chat, Amos, and that is from Lindy. Does Professor Guiora have any suggestions for dealing with enablers and bystanders or changing these cultures institutional responses?
I do. As Joe and Claire know, I've been very involved for 5 years now in working with American legislators on bystanding and criminalizing the bystander. And the next step is criminalizing the enabler. So here, I've literally been working on this around the clock for 5 years. Today's Thursday, right? On Tuesday, the Utah House of Representatives overwhelmingly voted in favor of a bill that I've been involved with for 5 years. So that's an enormous success. The problem is that tomorrow the legislative session ends, and it's unclear if the bill will come before the Senate tomorrow. We're right in the 90th minute. But the fact that we overwhelmingly won on Tuesday is a major step forward. There are 10 US states that have bystander laws. There are 28 countries that have bystander laws. So to the question, I absolutely am a firm believer in criminalizing this, and I'm a big believer in prosecuting. Changing in cultures and institutions. So it starts at the top. I mean, if the institution or institutional leadership tolerates enablers and bystanders, then there'll be enablers and bystanders. I'm a firm believer in, again, within the context of HR and all that, but of dismissing people. I think it should be a fireable offense. I think the institutions need to be sanctioned. At Michigan State University, Luanna Simon, who had been the president when NASA was there, she's a god-awful human being. She was forced to resign. I mean, it depends who you want to believe. She was resigned. I think, to your question in terms of changing institutions, we have to demand accountability. And Maddie Larson keeps saying this: stop with the blah 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 blah. It drives her crazy. All those ridiculous press statements. They want action. And what the girls, I use the word girls, obviously men and women. They want to see people. They want to see people held accountable. Some of them use graphic language. Some of them would like to see the institution burned, and I get that because they're pissed. So the people who I spent time now, they want real action. They want people criminalized, and they want to, if it need be, to have institutions to be held accountable, and if need be, for individuals to be thanked for or not to be thanked for the services, and to be shoved out the door, and also sanction. They also tell me the fact that, Michigan State paid the $500 million and or the Catholic Church paid, what the Catholic Church, right? That's not going to change anything. I mean, that's just money. That's not change.
Yeah. I think the other really important thing, and it sort of draws on the theme a little of voices, Amos, the other really important feature of changing an institution's culture is having conversations like this, listening to, hearing, and then responding to what is being said rather than dismissing it. But also having really clear processes in place that say,
Yes.
if you have a concern, here's where you go. If you know that something is wrong, here's what you do. And key to all of that is, what are some of the signs that there may be something wrong? Educating a community around those sorts of standards is really going to help change some of these problematic cultures.
Absolutely. And it's hard. I mean, institutions are,
Yeah.
slow to change, and institutions don't want to be confronted with the truth. And again, I don't know about in Australia, but, here in America, corporations are focused on the almighty dollar and, what will the shareholders say, and so on and so on and so on. The quarterly earnings up and down and blah, blah. That's just strikes me as a convenient excuse for not addressing the problem. By the way, again, without knowing about Australia, here in the United States, the issue is in the military, police departments, athletic. I mean, it goes beyond sports. But I do want to emphasize that this notion of the sexual assaults, it's an epidemic. I know we have Corona. But Corona will go away. Sexual assaults aren't going to go away unless we go after the enabler.
Yeah, absolutely. We've also got a question from Joe, who's had his hand patiently raised for quite a while now. Sorry, Joe.
Well, look, firstly, thank you so much, Amos, for coming and speaking with us all. And having read the book, I would encourage everybody here to go out and purchase a copy and read it as well, because it's a really compelling read, and one that touches so firmly on the beliefs that I think everybody in this room and in this virtual event holds. So my question was actually regarding the current legislation that you've been able to pass through the lower house in Utah, and I guess to sort of expand upon that a little from what you've already said, how did you find the process of bringing the public along? So we have very strong mandatory reporting laws here in Australia, and particularly in Victoria, but this idea around how do you then create the notion, the concept of criminalising the behaviour of the bystander and the enabler. How did you go about, you say it's a 5-year process, how did you go about those sort of nuclear steps in bringing people along? Because it's very easy to sort of say those things on a street corner and sound, quite deranged, but it's an entirely different thing to convert that into legitimate action. I just wouldn't mind if you could offer us some insight for people here out here in Ippities on how you did it.
First of all credit to the legislator who I've been working with for 5 years, Representative Brian King. I could go on and on about Representative King. He's been the ball carrier for 5 years. So I think the first thing you need, Joe, to your question, is you need a dedicated legislator who says, I'm with this until, and we've lost the first 3 or 4 years. I'm still, we'll see if we get to the Senate tomorrow, but again, it was a major first step. it was an overwhelming victory this week. The first thing you need is a legislator who's going to be the ball carrier. I think that's one. 2, to be focused on what you're trying to do. And we really were locked in. We were very open to criticism and to comments and more meetings and more meetings. It was a very, collaborative effort with stakeholders, with those who agreed and those who disagreed. It really, I think, whether we will get to the Senate tomorrow or not, I think that the dogged pursuit and addressing year after year the concerns that were raised, and I think maybe also respecting but minimizing concerns that have been raised. And politics is politics. You have to find the right people who will help you navigate.
Well, if I may, just for 1 second, just to add an addendum to that, or a follow-up, if I will, did you find this was received in a partisan way? I mean, obviously, you know, Australian politics is somewhat similar to US politics in it's a de facto two-party system with fringe parties, and you have what you consider to be conservatives and progressives. Did you find that this was a partisan issue, or was it something that you're actually able to create a space of non-partisanship?
Well, it's very simple in Utah. If you don't have the Republicans with you, you can't win anything. It's a very Republican heavy state. And Representative King is the Democratic head of the House. So we have to get Republicans on board. And I think that what Representative King was able to do was to find Republican champions who agreed with us. I confess, I did not understand why the bystander question is a Democrat-Republican issue. I didn't understand why it's a party issue. That I didn't. I mean, I understand some of the opposition. I didn't understand why it's a party issue, but it was, I think, largely seen as a Democratic initiative. This time, we literally got everybody on board.
Yeah.
That was a real success. I mean, hang on, we haven't passed the bill, and if you know, politics is politics, right? Exactly. It was a major step. I mean, I still wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning asking what will happen, but yes.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Amos, we've got one more question, and that is, in the book, you say, the more interviews I conducted with survivors, the greater my clarity regarding the need to create a framework facilitating criminalisation of the enabler. What exactly would you recommend?
To mirror the bystander legislation and to create a law where, like the Kathy Klagas is the coach who, tells Lemke, the scholarship thing, or the women trainers at Michigan State who, manipulated Tiffany off the team to make enabling a criminal act. Jurists have difficulty with the crime of omission as compared to the crime of commission. I understand that challenge, but just as we're working on criminalizing the enabler, I absolutely would work on just as we're working on criminalizing the bystander, I would work on criminalizing the enabler. The two go hand in hand. I agree with the education bit. I agree with that. But there has to be a penalty. And
yeah.
I would work, the two of you know, I'll work with anybody on this stuff, because I think without that, this epidemic will continue unabated. Yeah, we'll prosecute the perp, we'll put the perp in jail, but that's not the issue. That's not the issue at all. So that if there's one thing that, for me in terms of the book, it is this need to be actively engaged in policy discussions, political discussions, media discussions, to criminalize. I mean, that for me is absolutely essential.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, Amos, to have both of those elements in place when we're trying to undertake any sort of reform or cultural change. One doesn't function without the other, in my opinion.
That's right. I agree with that. It's a fight. It's a real fight.
It is. It is. But I think with works such as yours, particularly around your most recent book, Armies of Enablers, we've taken enormous steps forward in that fight. And I am absolutely delighted that you were able to join us here today.
Honored. I'm honored. Next time in person.
Absolutely. Next time, absolutely in person. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that this event was possible because we stand literally and also by Zoom on the traditional lands of Indigenous Australians. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Amen.
Amos, thank you again. It has been my absolute honour.
Thank you.
And privilege to both meet you and be part of this launch.
We have not yet begun to fight.
Absolutely. And I look forward to our next steps.
Thank you, my friends. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Or good day, whichever.
Thank you.
Enjoy your evening, Amos.
Thank you. Bye-bye.